My name is Yesenia Funes. I'm an environmental journalist. I've been covering issues of climate and environmental justice for over 10 years. You can find my writing in a number of places. I'm an editor-at-large at Atmos magazine. I write for Nat Geo, Vogue, Yale Climate Connections, Fox, and many more. So we're here today to talk about environmental defenders and the importance of the private sector giving environmental defenders a voice, a platform, and making them a central part of the transition to clean energy, especially as it pertains to the mining sector. I want to start with you, Mike, CEO of Global Witness. Since 2012, your organization has released an annual report on the deaths and the threats and the risks that environmental defenders face. Talk to us about this year's report, which I know just released, and the important findings related to private companies. What sort of takeaways can private companies glean from that report?
Yeah, thank you, Yesenia, and thanks everybody for coming. As Yesenia said, we started doing this work in 2012, and the reason we did that was because a former colleague of ours, a guy who had been part of the same team as me in Cambodia in the early 2000s, was killed while investigating an illegal logging operation. He was a man called Chut Vuti. After he left Global Witness, he set up his own organization and became the head of a kind of informal movement of environmental defenders. And he was murdered when he was investigating the interests of some very powerful companies in Western Cambodia. And this really jolted us into considering for the first time the extent to which threats to, attacks on land and environmental defenders might be a global phenomenon. We've been documenting this ever since, and as Yesenia said, we released our latest report, our latest annual report on attacks on land and environmental defenders just last week. And the findings are pretty stark and horrifying. We found that 146 land and environmental defenders lost their lives in 2024. Now, of those, around about a third were from indigenous or Afro-descendant communities, 10% were women, and there are particular parts of the world, particular countries which show up as the deadliest, and these are countries which repeatedly show up in this way in our statistics. So, for instance, there were 48 killings in Colombia last year, there were 20 in Guatemala, 19 in Mexico, 12 in Brazil, and then outside of Latin America you have the Philippines, which is a perennial hotspot with 8 killings. Now, Yesenia asked me about companies, so it's probably worth mentioning that when we gather this data, where we can, see what connections we can draw between these murders and particular business sectors. We can't do that in every case because we can only publish what we're really sure about. But something I think it's important to bring out is that the sector which has shown up as the most dangerous for land and environmental defenders in 2024 and in 2023 is mining. So last year we see 29 killings associated with mining businesses. The year before it was 25. Now, all of this is against the backdrop of a wider trend which you'll be familiar with in perhaps other realms and slightly different forms, which is increasing criminalization of land and environmental defenders globally. So we're not talking about outright physical attacks, murders in this case, but increasing prevalence of use by governments of sometimes existing laws, which are being repurposed and abused to go after defenders and shut them down, and sometimes draconian new ones. And I say this is a global phenomenon, and I don't say that lightly. I've talked about statistics relating to Latin America, but if you look at countries in Asia, for instance, if you take just 4, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, what we're seeing is that between 2018 and 2024, you have 341 land and environmental defenders who've been detained in circumstances which we would regard as criminalization. But it's not just countries in the global south. You know, I'm based in the UK. We found, based on requesting data from the Metropolitan Police, for instance, that since 2019, 7,000 people in the UK have been arrested in relation to climate action. And you don't need me to tell you what's going on here in the US. So that's a really important backdrop to these outright attacks, which companies need to be aware of. Now, to come round to the role of companies, we have a long list of recommendations here, but I'm going to pick out 3 things. So one is for companies which are undertaking operations, if you like, on site, on the ground, projects, if you will. A crucial thing which keeps coming out of our findings and what we learn from our partners in the global land and environmental defenders community is the importance of real, meaningful, transparent consultation before companies undertake projects of any kind. This has a particular codification, if you like, in international standards, especially when it comes to the rights of indigenous communities, what's known as free, prior, and informed consent, which is actually set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so this transparent, open, meaningful engagement is critical. But it's not just about companies which, if you like, do things on the ground. Companies which are involved in supply chains, which is pretty much all companies, also need to look at their responsibilities too. And we talk about this in terms of checks on supply chains. Due diligence is the term, which should be aimed at identifying and acting on risks of companies directly or indirectly giving rise to environmental abuses or human rights abuses. Again, there's actually plenty of really good standards to refer to here. Some of the bedrock ones would include the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. There's also the UN Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. And then this connects to a final point, which is we would urge companies, those that really take their responsibilities seriously, want to be leaders in this space, to support the enshrinement of these kinds of standards, free, prior, and informed consent, supply chain due diligence, in law. Now, this is a really hot issue at the moment because you may be aware over the past few years there's been a big effort, particularly in Europe, to introduce standards of this kind into EU regulation. And a particular law which we did a lot of work on with many of our dependent partners over the past few years was a piece of legislation which came out last year. It's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Now, this is a law which applies to companies operating in Europe, so not just European domiciled companies, so any company that does any sort of business in Europe. And it requires that companies do this due diligence on their supply chains to detect for, act on risks of environmental and human rights abuses. And it's got other very interesting provisions too, relating to climate commitments, and also a provision which would allow land and environmental defenders, affected communities, to bring legal action against companies in Europe that don't comply. Very powerful instrument. You probably won't be entirely surprised to hear that it's become the subject of a recent backlash by right-wing politicians in the EU and sadly certain business lobby groups too. So we would actually urge companies to step in, as some are, and make the case for keeping this law intact and getting it implemented. It's the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. Businesses that take their responsibilities seriously will actually benefit in competitive terms from the playing field being leveled by a law which requires all companies to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I really appreciate these points you're making, Mike. A lot of important points. I think there's one point I want to, just underscore, which is the criminalization of activists, right? It's crucial. It's not just happening in Europe or the global south. It's happening here in the U.S., right? We're seeing different laws being misunderstood by people in power. And, of course, many environmental defenders here in the States are also experiencing their own world of threats. And hopefully we'll have Prince Chima Williams join us at some point during the conversation to talk a little bit more about the environmental defenders. He's the executive director of Environmental Defenders Network. Marcel, one thing that Mike mentioned on due diligence, I know that a lot of your work sheds light on the consequences that business face, right, when they don't do their due diligence. Marcel is a fellow journalist based in Brazil. Would love to talk about the work that you're doing and what you've seen the private sector do in terms of how it's handling these human rights violations in Brazil, whether that's human trafficking in the coffee sector or dirty investments in the mining sector. Brazil is of particular importance. That's where the COP's going to be happening this year. Talk to us about how journalism is such an important tool in exposing those dynamics between companies and the people on the front lines.
Thank you very much for the question. So good morning, everyone. So Reporter Brazil, it's a NGO based in São Paulo, and we have been doing journalism, but we are an NGO. So the first part of our work is to produce high-quality journalism, and one of our main focus is to offer transparency for supply chains. So we identify human rights violations, environmental crimes, and our approach is to map supply chains in order to disclose names of companies, of importers, exporters involved with those problems. So we have reporting about this, and we have been distributing this content, also in partnerships with big outlets. Of course, we have our own website and social media, but we have contracts with some of the biggest outlets in Brazil. So that's part of our work, producing good journalism about human rights issues, environmental issues, in order to cover this space that, in general, big outlets are not focusing on these topics. But the other part of Repórter Brasil work, as I said, we are NGO. We have been engaging with companies, with governments, with business associations, in order to discuss about the solutions for those problems. So Repórter Brasil has been involved with many multi-stakeholders discussions, agreements, and I think it's a big part of the solution. These spaces where you can design solutions through these initiatives on a multi-stakeholder way. I think there are many companies that have an open mind to receive insights from civil society. I have examples in Brazil, for example, in the coffee sector, in the orange juice sector, where you can discuss, for example, with certification companies, strategies to improve what they are doing in the field in terms of the monitoring of supply chain. But to tell the truth, I think it's a very complex momentum, not only in Brazil, but in other countries, because I see that many companies are not interested anymore in this type of engagement as they are in the past. I think 15 years ago in Brazil, we built civil society and companies and federal administration very important agreements, for example, the soy moratorium, the agreements about the cattle sector. There is an important agreement in the state of São Paulo about the garment sector. But that was 15 years ago. I would say was like a golden era of this kind of approach. But nowadays it's much harder to speak with companies. I think we have less transparency on supply chains. So because of this, journalism is very important to offer transparency about what's happening, to expose companies that are not doing well. They work on monitoring what's happening in the field. Certification is part of the solution, but it's not all the solutions. There are good certifications, bad certifications, and I think this approach, journalism at the same time, involvement with civil society, is part of the solution for solving these problems.
Yeah, I really love what your organization is doing, sort of weaving journalism with community engagement and with accountability, stakeholder engagement. Yeah, I think that should be a model for more journalism globally, quite frankly. I would love to hear from you, Nicole, about the paths forward, right? We're here to talk about solutions, and I would love to get a sense of, what does a win-win scenario look like? And please introduce yourself as well, Nicole, your role with Global Witness.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Nicole Byrd, and I work on the Transition Minerals campaign at Global Witness. And I do want to stress that there are absolutely win-win paths forward in this, and there are common interests for all stakeholders. So can I just ask, where are my private sector folks? I'd love to know who I'm speaking to. Hi, thank you for being here. Oh, do I have a little reverb on the mic? Okay, thanks. So My examples will be of transition minerals, and given Mike's point that we found once again in this year's Defenders report that mining absolutely is the deadliest sector for defenders, I think these points will hit home. So I'd like to talk about a few different things. One has to do with stability and risk management. Another has to do with investor confidence and seeing through full project life cycles. And the third has to do with competitiveness. So on that stability and risk management piece, my team looked at the inherent instability in the mining sector. And specifically, we started looking at root causes. And we weren't all that surprised to find that it was a lack of what we consider the main three pillars of our transition minerals campaign that were actually at the root of a lot of this instability and conflict. So for the transition minerals campaign, our three pillars are best-in-class standards for the environment and human rights. 2 is equitable benefit sharing, so that we move away from those old extractive models where wealthier countries take and frontline communities and resource-rich countries don't really have much to show for it except maybe pollution, right? We have to move away from that and not keep repeating those mistakes. And the third is our absolute commitment to FPIC principles, as Mike also mentioned, free, prior, and informed consent. So anything else I talk about in the next few minutes, please understand that that is absolutely predicated on consent and community consultation. So going back to these root causes and the absence, I want to tie that to a statistic that came out of a 2021 study in a mining journal, and that's that 75% of mining projects close suddenly, just unexpectedly. 75%. I mean, that's huge. It's expensive, it's wildly inefficient. And that means that doing things the right way, right, having those best-in-class standards, making sure communities are full and equal partners, that starts to look like very smart risk management if you're a company on the ground. I realize that in the mining sector right now, there are a lot of other factors at play. There's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on that is maybe a little bit outside the scope of what we have time for today. But smart risk management means controlling the risk that you can, and doing things the right way is controlling what you can. And that leads me to my point about investor confidence. Despite all the headlines about transition minerals, I've heard from a lot of corners that the money is not necessarily free-flowing right now, despite demand, despite the attention. And I would posit that having a case that you can make that you are much more likely to realize, say, a planned 20-year life cycle of your project instead of getting shut down after 18 months, whether it's by a country's Supreme Court because you didn't follow all the laws or do your environmental due diligence properly. That's something I think can only behoove investor confidence as well as community confidence. And those better odds, okay, I know that people who have MBAs are going to tell me exactly what I've heard from parts of the business community. Full disclosure, I live with an MBA. My husband has one. And his first comment when I brought up some of this stuff was, honey, you know that your first semester in B school, they tell you that you should recoup as many of your expenses and costs as quickly as you can in a project in case things go sideways. I get that, but I think a better mentality for all stakeholders is, again, to think long-term, to think stable, and to think equitable. And I can't see any investors shying away from that. Certainly, I can't see communities shying away from having people who are fully committed to involving them in doing things the right way. So my last point is a little bit about competitiveness. And for this, I'd like to focus on water. So we know that with climate change, dry areas are just getting drier. It's already happening. It's only going to get worse. And in certain dry areas that are crucial for transition minerals like Chile, where a lot of our lithium and copper come from, water issues are already extremely fraught between communities, the ecosystems that they live in, and these companies and their projects on the ground. So when you look at that, you look at what's coming with less water in those areas, I would say this is a great moment for companies to set themselves up well for future viability. So for example, I can't think of a good reason that if you're mining in a dry area, why you wouldn't invest now in a fully closed loop water recycling system. It's going to prevent you from taking resources from those communities, from the environment that they really need it. It's going to potentially be what determines your solvency in the coming years, right? You can't buy water that isn't there. And in areas of water scarcity, here's my last fun statistic. In areas of water scarcity, it actually adds up to an extra 30% of mining costs. That's huge. That will blow your budget very quickly and potentially make the difference between whether you're operating 3 years from now or not. So when you look at all of these benefits for leaving a light touch on the environment, for making sure you're not competing with frontline communities, and then setting yourselves up well with a little bit of an extra investment now, I see that as very, very much a win-win path. And I think that if we look for these things, there are actually more overlapping interests that affect all stakeholders than might be readily apparent sometimes. I'm sure I'm at time, so I'm going to pass it back, but thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. I think that point of community buy-in is such a critical part, too, right, of how companies can move forward in an effective and also like cost-effective way, right? I know in the United States there's a lot of conversation right now about abundance and policy reform, permitting reform, and I'm doing a story on this right now, so it's like top of mind. But there's a lot of concern of like, what do we lose when we reform our permitting process too, especially with like the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a critical part of public engagement, public comments. And so these are the important questions that we need to be asking ourselves and conversations we need to be having around, how do we get things going to address the climate crisis and the clean energy transition while not also losing a really important part of community buy-in and community engagement. Chima, thank you for joining us. Good to see you. It's all right. New York City, getting around, it's always chaotic. Appreciate you being here. I'd love to hear from you, as now that you're here with us, you're the executive director of the Environmental Defenders Network. Can you give the audience a sense of who we're talking about when we're talking about environmental defenders? I know you work closely with these frontline activists. How would you define environmental defenders? Talk to us about who these people are and why their leadership is so needed. I'm not sure if there's like specific people you want to name, but just sort of paint a portrait for us of who we're talking about when we talk about environmental defenders.
All right, thank you very much. My apologies is the chaotic situation. I've been up since 6 a.m. At least I chatted with Anna that I was already prepared, but all the roads getting blocked. Well, Environmental Defenders Network is a platform that is quite young because we are just less than about a year plus. By April next year will be 2. But it is populated by seasoned activists, environmentalists, journalists, community defenders, who's been on the turf. For some of us who've been there for over 20 years, working on this on the environment sector and defending community rights, people's rights. Part of what we do now is that we are involved in different categories of activities. Of course, from my background as a lawyer and having used that effectively as part of the Friends of the Earth Federation, and still providing those services to community people and organizing a legal platform in Nigeria to support the less privileged, those that cannot provide the high cost of hiring legal services of lawyers, providing pro bono services to them, to protect and defend their environment and livelihood rights. of course, under Environmental Defenders Network, we've scaled up a little bit to include issues of water, water campaign. We belong to a consortium that is trying to stop the Lagos state government from privatizing water. Okay, Lagos state government under the Lagos Water Corporation received support from Water Aid to privatize water in the state, but we are engaging the community people, legislators at the state level, including the corporation itself, to see that we bring a halt to that privatization efforts. And so far, we are achieving little results because for the first time, we've compelled the corporation to come out, to say that they are not going to privatize water, but they are going to be engaged in what they call public-private partnership. And only God knows what that translates to, if not, handing over the water sector to the private hands. But we are calling for a new system that has worked in some other parts of the world, including Malawi in Africa, public-public partnership for water handling so that water will be available and in the hands of the people. Also, we are delving into issue of mining. Of course, Nigeria is well known for her petroleum resources, but in the quest of the energy transition, Nigeria has developed or is looking for new source of resource. Lithium mining is going on in large scales, but unreported in different parts of Nigeria. Even though Nigeria does not present lithium as a critical mineral for the just energy transition, they are presenting gas as the resource. But for us, we've been querying the government and the system because in Nigeria there are two kinds of gas resource, even though we are very rich in each of them: the natural gas, the associated gas. And it is the associated gas that is being vented through gas flaring, which we've gotten the court to declare as an illegal activity for undermining citizens' rights to life and dignity of the human person. But that is not the resource that Nigeria is presenting as its own critical mineral. It's rather, it is presenting the natural unassociated gas that has little problems. Of course, the associated gas is the one that creates a whole lot of health and environmental problems in the country and destroys livelihoods. So, these are things that we are challenging. We are still in court to defend the case of Jen Agbemre against Shell, where we defeated Shell at the lower court when the court declared in 2005 that gas flaring is illegal. And interestingly, Shell lived in denial of the existence of that judgment against it for over 13 years until 2018, when on its own, as a result of pressure, appealed against the judgment that they claimed was not in existence. So we are in court, at the Court of Appeal, trying to defend that victory. But good thing is that we had used the judgment at the lower court to pressure the government of Nigeria to take steps. And that judgment of John Gomes against Shell was the foundation of the Nigerian Climate Change Act. Okay, because it came first as a policy, gas flaring prohibition of waste policy 2018, where the opening statement of that policy document states that gas flaring is illegal. Okay, that's section 3, section 1, subsection 3 of that policy document. And there is no other law in Nigeria that had outlawed gas flaring apart from the case of John Gomes against Shell, which we led. Okay, so, and that also led to, I played a role in getting the government under the late president to sign onto the Climate Change Act, from bill to an act. So we are engaged both in policy issues, we are engaged in community mobilization, community enlightenment, and provision of legal support to indigent citizens, as well as amplifying the voices of the people by providing media platforms for them to speak to the public. Thank you.
Chima. Thank you. I'm hearing a lot of similar sort of points being made across the board around policy making, the need for action in the courts. I'd love to end this conversation with a note from you all on how do we make this change happen? Should we focus primarily on the courts? Should we focus on policy change? Should we focus on culture and society, right? The stories we tell and the hearts that they can touch. How do we get to a place where private companies are taking seriously the need for human rights, and not just taking seriously, but really required, right, to address the human rights concerns of a clean and just transition? And we'll start with you, Mike, and we'll just go down.
Yeah, I think they're all important, all of these areas, the policy, the narrative, public opinion side of things, and also the courts, as we were just hearing from Chima. We can see obstacles in all those areas at the moment, but there's also opportunities to move the needle too. I'll just pick out one thing. I was struck by something Marcel said about multi-stakeholder initiatives, so efforts to bring together different types of stakeholders, actors to get behind initiatives. And a bright spot for us thinking about this work in relation to protection of land and environmental defenders is a new initiative of this kind. It's called the Leaders Network for Environmental Activists and Defenders. And it's a loose, so far sort of loose collaboration of around about 40 international and national NGOs in consultation with around 100 grassroots organizations. There's 11 governments involved. I've had to get used to saying 11 rather than 12 because the US was one of them, and now, strangely enough, it's not. And also about half a dozen UN agencies and UN rapporteurs. Now, this LEAD initiative, we're very excited about it. It's due to be announced, launched, and in fact championed by the government of Brazil at COP30 in November at Belém. And it's got two main objectives, and one of those is to increase protection of land and environmental defenders globally and initiate practical ways of making that happen. And the other is to do with access to decision-making. If you go to climate summits like COP, and frankly other sort of policy-making spaces, you would see the same thing. You've got really the sort of land and environmental defenders, the kind of folks that Chima was describing, sort of on the outside looking in, and then you've got corporate interests, those with the most to lose, particularly oil and gas, who are in the negotiations with a hand sort of literally and sometimes literally and sometimes figuratively on the pen. So the idea is that this LEAD initiative would increase protection for defenders and also increase their access to participation in decision making. So that sort of crosses over the policy and the narrative side. My own view is that the extent to which we can all help people to understand that the role of land and environmental defenders is integral to climate. That will help to increase recognition of the important work that they do on behalf of all of us.
Sure. So the how is so situational by place and community, by sector. I think it's hard to be prescriptive, but I think we can talk about some mentality shifts that are necessary. And one is to just foot stomp a little bit more, that idea of thinking of doing things the right way for the long term and not have such a short-term mentality. Another, I think, is to really center partnerships. I was speaking at a conference on water and mining this spring, and there was a woman speaker, Jenny Liu, if you're listening on the live stream, shout out. But she was a member of both an indigenous community in Canada and a mining family. And she pointed out that when you have these partnerships where you are actually learning from the community's knowledge of the land, the water, the patterns. She made this great point that environmental assessments are a snapshot in time, and that those same areas that you look at in November could be essential breeding grounds come spring, or migratory paths, or something like that. So the fact that these communities know their land and water and area so well also means that if there's that deep communication and deep trust, that's your early warning system. So when you have someone who has access and can come to you and say, something's not right in the water, as a private sector stakeholder or a government stakeholder, you catch it early. And this is something I've talked with the head of IRMA a bit about, so shout out to Amy too if you're on the live stream somewhere. But it's always better to catch things early and nip them in the bud. And that leads to that issue of transparency, right? Nobody wants to be the next company that's featured in an OCCRP article because they've hidden their water pollution for 10 years and lied about it publicly. I won't name the company name because I know we have not independently corroborated the reporting, but it's really interesting reporting. So that transparency piece goes hand in hand with the deep and true partnerships aspect as well.
Yeah. I think in the case of Brazil, we have good examples. For example, in the fight against modern slavery. It's a kind of national policy that was designed in a multi-stakeholder initiative with the participation of civil society, grassroots movements, companies, business associations, of course, many governmental agencies. And that happened years ago, 18 years ago, when we built the second national plan for the eradication of slavery. And now we are building the third national plan in the same way. There are the involvement of many parts of the private sector. I understand it's a very specific issue because nobody wants to see slave workforce involved with supply chains. And I understand that there are other challenges related to other sectors. For example, in the mining sector, critical minerals, or even in the cattle industry. Because in general, companies or business associations are not too much interested in engaging in this kind of initiative. I think it's very important to take advantage of, in the case of Brazil, of the political momentum we have there, because we have a more progressist federal government. We don't know what's going to happen 2 years later, but now we are trying to implement these initiatives again. Although we understand that the challenges are higher than in the past. But I really believe this type of initiative, this type of policies and national plans that can be designed by all these areas of the supply chain and with the involvement of civil society. Depend on the country, you can address other solutions, but I think the first step is a good political assessment in order to understand what is the best solution.
Right, thank you. From our perspective, the challenges are enormous because this is a country where the corporate more or less controls the government structures that led us to what we call corporate capture, where, for instance, we've had situations where all our indigenous petroleum ministers have always come from the multinationals backgrounds, from either Shell or Chevron or ExxonMobil, So that will tell you what type of policy that will come out from such backgrounds. And even our National Oil Corporation, the NNPC, are always in joint venture arrangements with the companies. Okay? So, this poses great challenges for defenders because you are not just fighting the corporates, you are also seen as fighting your government. And because we have been sold the lies that if you stop, for instance, oil business in Nigeria, there will be no money to run the economy, which is a lie because Nigeria is well endowed and blessed with diverse, resources, including human capital resources that can run the nation if only we get our governance systems right. Okay, so this is where the biggest challenge is. We see defenders being, on trump of charges of different kinds just for speaking up. We're handling some cases, for instance, in a state where we supported a community activist to speak out. His own representatives are instigated to come after him. So it looks as if it is not the corporates or the corporate entities that are coming after you. It is your own people, whereas we know who are behind those kind of actions. So, how do we come out of it? For some of us, we've just decided that, look, whatever going to happen will happen. Okay? So, I was inspired yesterday watching, the video, the film screening yesterday, where even though our friends' comrades had been assassinated, arrested, he still decided to continue to trudge on. And this is the only way, until we all decide that we do not have another planet, we do not have another earth, we do not have another country, we do not have another community, to inherit or bequeath to the future generation, then the struggle just has to continue. Okay? And we think that we have to come by way of knowledge, collaboration, experience sharing, like what we are doing here, trying to hear from each other and be strengthened by each other. And what I tell my colleagues in country is, look, you cannot fight the corporates as an individual. And that is why some of the biggest hegemons are called multinationals. Right. So if you must fight them and have meaning, you must also be multinational in your own approach and dimension. So, which means collaboration is the only way we can save the world. No individual can fight and win this battle of defending the environment, defending the land, defending the waters, defending the forests, and defending the rights of nature and citizens, except we all collectively hold hands together to fight. We will individually be submerged.
Thank you, Chima. Yeah, international solidarity is probably what we all need the most right now. And the stakes are high, right? The cost is high for every day that there is inaction, and the environmental defenders that you all work so closely, they're putting their lives in line every day to defend their water, their air, their families, and their communities. So thank you all for your really wonderful remarks today. Would love to open up to questions. I think we have maybe 10 minutes or so for some questions. Yeah, please raise your hand and Eden will come with the mic. And please introduce yourself as well.
Morning. Thank you so much for this very interesting session. My name is Susan, and I work in the natural resource governance area in the Copper Belt. So DRC and Zambia, we have some environmental rights defenders programs there and so forth. And so obviously, you know, DRC is at the center of the transition minerals and all of that. So my question is, given that so much of the resources still leave these resource-rich countries, right, and they go elsewhere, at what point do we also need to involve the consumer? You know, something like the Blood Diamonds movement or textile industry with the child labor and all the big companies, the corporates that got in trouble, because my observation is a company's mandate is to make money, and they will do so until they're mandated to have a different practice. I'd love to think that, yes, there are some companies that do things because they have a conscience and they want to be a good company and so forth. But I can tell you in the DRC, it's a race to the bottom. I spoke to the head of USAID there when I was at Mining Week in Lubumbashi 2 years ago, and I asked him about US companies, and he said, well, at least we're not as bad as China. And I said, wow, is that really the goal? Not as bad as China. You know, so there's geopolitical considerations, there's corruption, and the companies are the ones that lose all the resources. So, you know, is there a way that we can show every single person here the phone in your pocket has cobalt, you know, and other things in it that probably has a human rights violation in it, and how do countries then hold their corporations to a higher standard? So that's my one question. And the second one, can you speak to the critical minerals treaty that's out there? I believe Colombia and Brazil were going to propose it even here, but I think it's going to be later in the year now, not at COP. I'm just curious if there's a way to get more indigenous voices part of that. Like, I just don't have a lot of visibility on it, and I know it's bubbling. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So that's on the role of consumers, right, as well as the Critical Minerals Treaty. Who wants to take those on, or one of them on?
Brief comment. So that first bit about consumers, I think, plugs into that last point I made about transparency. We have to have consumers who demand transparency about supply chains and good due diligence and verification systems all along those supply chains. And we need the public badly to advocate for and push for better policies, better laws, better corporate practices in publishing their information and how they're checking the sources of their materials. That's an initial thought, but I'd love to hear from the rest of you.
Yeah, so I can jump in this. So in Brazilian civil society, I think we understand that we cannot focus only in one solution. So because when we have regime changing in Brazil, it changed a lot in terms of what strategy is the best for the political momentum. So always you need to in the case of Reporter Brazil, transparency on supply chains is one of our main focus. So we want to talk about who are the companies involved with the problems. We want to disclose names of farmers, importers, exporters. So it's something, I think it's fundamental to increase the transparency of supply chains, independently of the political momentum you are living in the country. Of course, engaging with companies, I think it's important. Doing capacity building work with companies. There are very good people working in CSR departments. But I think, of course, especially in the case of Brazil, the best solution is the improvement of public policies. Reporter Brazil, we have an office in Brasilia. I have people in our staff engaging with policymakers. We understand that it's very important to do advocacy work in the parliament, but as we have a more progressive federal government nowadays, we understand that the advocacy in the federal government, the federal level, is the best for this momentum. So we are designing new public policies, legal frameworks in Brazil. We are working, for example, in a new national human rights and business policy. I mentioned the new plan for the eradication of slavery. We still don't have in Brazil, for example, a national tool, public tool for the traceability of the cattle herd in the country. So the federal government launched a plan 2 years ago, but it still needs to be implemented. We are working on it. So improve legal legislation and, of course, pushing for more enforcement of the legislation, I think, in general, is the best solution. That's what we learned from the past. And a quick remark on critical materials. We have been working on these topics. On this topic, we have been producing a lot of content and investigation about gold, for example. We have a big problem in Brazil regarding the illegal gold mining within indigenous territories. We recently published a report about nickel, also with strong impacts in our indigenous communities in the Amazon area, the Xikrin indigenous community. And the federal government is now starting discussing with the society a specific legal framework for managing the exploration of critical materials in Brazil. It's just the beginning. We don't know how that will happen in the future, but we hope to engage with the federal government, with the parliament on designing this new policy in the country.
I want to make sure we have time for more questions. Yes, Eden, whoever.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Ivana, and I work at the intersection of climate and human rights, a lot of gender equality as well. And I had 2 short questions, I hope short. One is, how do we manage the fact that we want to push for better national policies and laws that protect environmental defenders, but at the same time we know that a lot of time governments are the ones that are involved in many of the violence that goes on against a lot of indigenous and other groups, so they do not feel safe perhaps creating or participating in government-run programs designed for their safety when they are actually feeling attacked by those same actors or by actors that are very intrinsically linked to the government through the publicly owned mines, for example, or partly publicly owned. And the second question is whether there is any focus on gender equality and women and girls specifically, as you said 10% approximately are women and girls that have been killed. Whether you also have looked into the other threats that women and girls specifically receive or suffer from, such as sexual and gender-based violence, intimidation of their families, et cetera, and how that plays into all of your work. Thank you so much.
Chima, do you want to speak on the government part of trying to collaborate with governments despite the corruption that exists?
Well, the biggest bane is a corrupted system. Because once the system is corrupted, every other thing becomes problematic. Why do we have ineffective laws or regulations? Or where there is in existence such regulations, why do we have weak enforcement mechanisms and processes? From our background, yes, it is more or less like tokens. Government picks whatever they think is good for the people and decides without consultation with the people. Of course, in terms of the sector that is key to us, which is where government revenue is generated mostly from, how are the people carried along in the design of those policies to make it resonate with them as meant for them? Okay, we talk about things like free, prior, informed consent, FPIC. How does it play in reality? Most of the time, engagements by government entities and the corporates is just a smokescreen, greenwashing, just to make it look as if they are adhering, but at the end of the day, how do they consult with the people? After, where there is consultation, who are the people that are consulted? Contractors to the companies, government cronies, leaving the real people, without a voice. This is where the biggest challenge lies in all the discourse. Okay? Until we begin to get it right, because like my friends mentioned, there are some good guys, nice guys in the companies, but without strong regulations, there is nobody, no business entity is a good guy. There is none. Experience have shown me this. None. So businesses, companies are only forced to do the right thing. They never do it freely and willingly. No, they are compelled. And when that force, compelling force is absent, you have the situation we have in our country where companies determines what happens. So, if we take it from that perspective, we'll be asking ourselves the critical question: what needs to change? Okay? It's not just about regime change, for instance, because you can still change the regime and still have, the same situation playing out. Like in Nigeria, every 4 years, Nigerians are subjected to, going to vote. And what comes out of their voting? Does it change anything? The country keeps getting from bad to worse. We used to think that the last regime was going to be the worst. But the present regime, without apologies, Nigerians are agreed on this. Majority of Nigerians, that things are getting worse and worse and worse every day. So we must change the political system itself so that power can be in the hands of the people, so that the people can change their own narratives and their own destinies.
And Mike, do you want to just speak quickly about the gender equality aspect of Global Witness? And I think with that we'll wrap up for the morning.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. What we see through perhaps less through the headline data we gather, but more through the testimonies and what our partners tell us, is there are an array of gender-based forms of threats, intimidation, and violence, which are visited upon female land and environmental defenders. Some of those include threats of sexual violence, attacks of that nature, and then we see more insidiously, if you like, you might say misuse of certain cultural norms to ostracize and marginalize female defenders. One of the ways in which we saw this come out recently in a piece of work we published a few weeks back was looking at the relationship between online threats and, if you like, physical attacks. And again, what we were hearing from female defenders who we interviewed for this was that there was this very high preponderance of gender-based threats and forms of intimidation. I just wanted to make one more comment, if I may. It's on Suzanne's earlier question about the cynicism to do with the scramble for resources. I mean, 100%. We did some investigations some years back into a clutch of deals on Congolese cobalt and copper, which cost the Congolese population about $1.36 billion. What we found was that the deals all tracked back to a small number of shell companies in the British Virgin Islands. They were all linked to a tycoon called Dan Gertler, close confidant of the then president of Congo. Now, in recent times, there's some reporting in the US press, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, about efforts by the US government to get Dan Gertler off the US sanctions list, which he was on for corruption, so that he could help them facilitate new deals which would benefit the US in the context of the competition with China. This was actually confirmed to me informally by somebody in the US government. So the level of cynicism is pretty extreme. And there is an air of desperation now about all the big powers piling in on countries like Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to take what they regard as meeting their needs in terms of security of supply, and it's very, very worrying.
Well, the answers are not simple or easy, and sometimes they will be a little cynical and sad, but I think one thing that I've gleaned from this conversation is that the only way that we can come to the answers and to the solutions is if we're willing to work together across borders, across the globe, and that's where the real solutions lie. Thank you all for joining us this morning.